There is a single object that has been manufactured more than any other plastic thing on Earth. More than syringes, more than bottle caps. It fits in the palm of a child's hand. There are roughly 80 of them for every living person on the planet. You almost certainly own some right now, in a drawer, in a box, somewhere underfoot in the dark. A Lego brick made in 1958 still clicks perfectly into one made this morning. That is not an accident. It is the result of an obsession that nearly bankrupted the family who built it. Not once, but again and again. Because before Lego was the most powerful brand in the world, before the movies and the theme parks and the billions of bricks, it was a pile of ashes. A burned-out workshop in a Danish village almost nobody could find on a map. And the man standing in front of those ashes had already lost almost everything. This is the story of how he, and the 3 generations after him, kept rebuilding from nothing. His name was Ole Kirk Christiansen, a master carpenter in Billund, a farming village in the flat heart of Jutland, Denmark. In 1916, he bought a small woodworking shop and built furniture, doors, and houses for local farmers. He was good. He was careful. He believed deeply that a thing worth making was worth making properly. But the world was not careful with him. In 1924, his 2 young sons were playing in the workshop and accidentally set fire to a pile of wood shavings. The workshop and the family home burned to the ground. Ole Kirk rebuilt, bigger than before. Then came the loss that no insurance could cover. His wife died, leaving him alone with 4 boys. And then the global economy itself collapsed. The Great Depression rolled across the farms of Jutland, and farmers who could barely feed their families were not buying new furniture. By the early 1930s, the orders had nearly stopped completely. Ole Kirk Christiansen was a widower, a father of 4, and a craftsman with almost no one left to sell to. So he made a bet that looked, from the outside, like surrender. If grown men in a depression would not buy his furniture, he would make something for the one customer who never stops wanting things: children. Out of the same fine beech and the same offcuts of wood, he began carving toys, piggy banks, pull-along trucks, yo-yos, and a small wooden duck on wheels. Its beak hinged so it quacked open as a child pulled it along. It was a humiliating step down for a master builder of houses. Toys were frivolous. Toys were not serious work. His fellow tradesmen told him he was wasting good timber on playthings. But here is the thing about that duck. He refused to make it cheaply. He gave each toy the same lacquer, the same sanding, the same finish he had given to furniture, meant to last a lifetime. Money was so tight that he sometimes traded toys for food from local farmers. He was, by any honest measure, failing, but he had stumbled onto the idea that would outlive him, that a child's toy deserved to be built like it mattered. By 1934, the little toy business needed a name. Ole Kirk held a contest among his handful of employees, with a bottle of homemade wine as the prize. He ended up choosing his own entry, a word he built by jamming together 2 Danish words, leg Godt. It means, simply, play well. He named the company Lego. Years later, someone pointed out that in Latin, Lego can mean I put together, or I assemble. He had no idea at the time. It was a happy accident, layered on top of a careful choice. And then there is the story that became family scripture. Ole Kirk's son Gottfried, then a teenager working in the shop, proudly told his father he had saved the company money by giving a batch of wooden ducks only 2 coats of lacquer, instead of the usual 3. Ole Kirk made him take every single duck back, recoat them, and reship them, at the company's own expense. The lesson he carved into his son that day became the company's creed, words that still hang in the factory: only the best is good enough. The company survived the Depression. It did not survive untouched. In 1942, in the middle of the German occupation of Denmark, an electrical short circuit sparked in the factory. The building caught, and for the second time in Ole Kirk's life, fire took almost everything he had built. The factory, the stock, and the wooden blueprints for nearly every toy he had ever designed. Imagine standing in front of that, twice. Once as a young man, now as a grandfather of the business, in the middle of a war, in an occupied country, with materials rationed and the future of the entire continent in doubt. He could have walked away. No one would have blamed him. Instead, Ole Kirk did the only thing he knew how to do. He rebuilt again. A larger, more modern factory rose on the ashes of the old one, and in that new building he made a decision that everyone around him thought was foolish. He began to look, very seriously, at a strange new material that most respectable toy makers despised. A material that would either save the company or finally finish it. The material was plastic. In 1947, Ole Kirk did something almost reckless for a small toy maker recovering from a fire. He spent an enormous sum, more than a year of profits, to buy one of the first plastic injection molding machines in all of Denmark. His business partners thought he had lost his mind. Plastic was seen as cheap, flimsy, a wartime substitute for real materials. Serious toys were made of wood and metal. Danish shopkeepers would later send shipments back with notes, saying plastic would never sell. But Ole Kirk had seen something. With a mold and this machine, he could make the exact same perfect object thousands of times, with a precision no hand-carved toy could ever match. In 1949, the company released a product called automatic binding bricks, small, hollow-studded plastic blocks that could stack and lock together. They were recognizably the ancestor of the modern Lego brick. The toy buyers shrugged, sales were poor. Children liked them well enough, but the bricks had a problem nobody had solved yet, a flaw that made the whole idea look like a dead end. Here is the problem that almost killed the brick before it began. The early bricks had studs on top, but they were hollow and open underneath. They could be stacked. They could not really hold. Build a small wall and bump the table, and it collapsed. The connection was weak, the grip unreliable, and a toy that falls apart the moment a child touches it is not a toy a parent buys twice. By the mid-1950s, the plastic gamble looked like exactly the mistake everyone had warned about. The wooden toys were still paying the bills. The bricks were a curiosity that didn't quite work. By now, Ole Kirk was aging, and his son Gottfred, the boy once made to re-lacquer the ducks, was effectively running the company. And Gottfred became obsessed with a single question that sounds almost childish, but contained the entire future of the business inside it. How do you make a small plastic brick lock firmly to another brick, hold its grip through hundreds of builds and still come apart easily in a child's hands? Solve that, and you don't have a toy. You have a system. The answer was almost invisible. You would never see it unless you turned the brick over. Gottfred and his engineers added small hollow tubes to the inside-underside of the brick. When you press one brick onto another, the round studs on top grip against those inner tubes from the inside. The result was a clutch. A grip strong enough to hold a build together through being carried, dropped, and rebuilt, yet gentle enough that a small child could pull two bricks apart. They called it the stud and tube coupling system. On the 28th of January 1958, at 1:58 in the afternoon, the company filed the patent. That exact brick design is why a brick from that year still snaps cleanly onto a brick made today. 6 decades of compatibility, locked into a piece of plastic the size of a thumbnail. It was the quiet engineering breakthrough that turned a failing novelty into the foundation of everything. A Lego set was no longer a box of toys. It was a language. A small number of standard pieces that could combine into nearly infinite things. And at the moment of that triumph, the family was struck again. In 1960, fire struck the Christiansen family a third time. Lightning hit the warehouse that stored the company's wooden toys, and the entire wooden inventory burned. Most families would have read that as a curse. Gottfred read it as a sign. He made a clean, ruthless decision. The company would abandon wooden toys completely and bet its entire future on the plastic brick system. From now on, Lego would make one thing, and make it better than anyone alive. He built the idea into a philosophy he called the system of play. Every set, every theme, every new piece had to be compatible with every other piece, forever. A wheel bought in one decade had to fit an axle made in the next. The brick was no longer a product. It was a promise that the company could never break without breaking itself. Through the 1960s, sales exploded across Europe. In 1968, the family opened a park in their tiny home village of Billund, Legoland, built from millions of bricks. Almost overnight, a global crowd was making the pilgrimage to a Danish farming town most of the world had never heard of. For the next 30 years, the brick seemed unstoppable. Lego became one of the most admired companies on Earth and a fixture in tens of millions of homes. The company introduced the minifigure, the small yellow person with a friendly painted smile and movable arms, and suddenly the bricks had inhabitants. There were castles, pirate ships, space stations, and entire towns. Surveys repeatedly ranked Lego as one of the most trusted brands in the world, and for a generation of children across Europe, North America, and Asia, the sound of hands sifting through a bin of bricks was the sound of childhood itself. The company stayed in family hands and made real money. By the 1990s, it employed thousands of people and shipped bricks to nearly every country on the planet. From a charred workshop and a wooden duck the Christiansen family had built a genuine empire of play. And that, strangely, is exactly where the danger began, because a company that has won for 30 straight years stops asking whether it might be wrong. Success, it turns out, can be more dangerous than fire. By the late 1990s, a fear took hold in the company's leadership. Video games were rising, computers were everywhere. A wave of consultants and executives became convinced that the humble plastic brick was old-fashioned, that children no longer wanted to slowly build things by hand. The panic produced a frenzy of activity. Lego decided it could no longer just be a brick company. It would become a lifestyle brand. So it expanded in every direction at once. It opened its own theme parks, which devoured enormous amounts of cash. It launched clothing lines and watches. It opened branded retail stores. It poured money into video games and a movie studio. It invented thousands of new, specialized pieces for elaborate theme sets, pieces that fit only one model and nothing else. The number of different elements the company produced ballooned to around 13,000. Each new piece needed its own expensive mold. The product line became chaos. And in the rush to be everything, the company quietly betrayed its own founding promise, that the brick and the system behind it was the whole point. They had forgotten the duck. They had forgotten the lacquer. Then the bill came due. In 2003, the strategy collapsed all at once. Sales fell off a cliff, down roughly 30% in a single stretch. The sprawling empire of parks and side ventures was bleeding cash. That year, the company that built the world's most beloved toy lost close to $300 million. At the worst of it, Lego was burning through something on the order of $1 million every single day. The company was carrying around $800 million in debt. Analysts ran the numbers and reached a brutal conclusion. At this rate, the Lego Group would be bankrupt within months. A 70-year-old family business that had survived the Great Depression, an occupation, and 3 separate fires was now being killed by the one thing it had always wanted: its own success. The family that had rebuilt from ashes again and again faced a humiliating possibility that this time, the thing burning down was not a workshop they could rebuild. It was the company itself. And for the first time in its history, the people in charge admitted they did not know how to save it. The man who would save the company was not a member of the family, and that mattered. His name was Jørgen Vig Knudstorp. He was a former McKinsey consultant in his mid-30s who had joined Lego only a few years earlier. In 2004, the owner did something almost unthinkable for a proud family business. He handed control to this young outsider, making Knudstorp the first chief executive who did not carry the founder's blood. Knudstorp's diagnosis was quiet and devastating. The company, he said, had grown addicted to growth itself. It had confused doing more with doing better. It had chased every shiny idea and lost sight of the one thing it was uniquely good at on the entire planet: the brick. His plan was the opposite of everything a panicking company usually does. He did not call for a bold new product or a flashy reinvention. He told a company that was terrified the brick was dying that the brick was the only thing that could save them. The answer to a crisis caused by doing too much, he argued, was to do dramatically less. What followed was one of the most disciplined turnarounds in corporate history, and it was built almost entirely on subtraction. Knudstorp sold off the cash-hungry theme parks. He shut down the in-house video game division. He pulled the company out of the side ventures it had no business being in. Then he attacked the chaos at the heart of the product itself. The company had ballooned to roughly 13,000 different elements. He cut it nearly in half, back towards 7,000, killing the one-use specialty pieces and forcing designers to build new sets out of the existing, compatible system bricks. Every part now had to earn its place. He listened, obsessively, to the adult fans and the children who actually loved the brick instead of the consultants who feared it. He rebuilt the company's finances around making fewer things, more profitably, with the brick at the dead center of everything. It was, in spirit, the lesson of the under-lacquered ducks all over again. Strip away everything that isn't the real work, and do the real work properly. Slowly, the bleeding stopped. Then the company started to grow again. The right way this time. The recovery did not just work. It became one of the great comebacks in business. Within a few years, the company that analysts had pronounced nearly dead was setting profit records. New sets tied to films and built around the system bricks sold by the hundreds of millions. Then, in 2014, a feature film made almost entirely of computer-rendered bricks became a global box office hit, turning the toy itself into a movie star. The next year, Lego did something that would have been unimaginable in the ashes of 2003. It passed the giant American toy maker Mattel to become the largest toy company in the entire world. Revenue climbed past $5 billion and kept going. Surveys began naming Lego the single most powerful brand on Earth, ahead of car makers, ahead of tech giants. A company built on a piece of plastic the size of a thumbnail, run from a small Danish village, had reached the top of the entire global brand landscape. And the brick at the center of all of it was still, fundamentally, the same brick the family had patented back in 1958. Unchanged and unbeaten. Step back and look at the whole shape of it. A bankrupt carpenter in a village almost no one could find. A workshop that burned, a wife lost, a factory that burned again, and a warehouse struck by lightning. A gamble on a cheap material everyone despised. A tiny tube, hidden inside a brick, that made 6 decades of toys click together as one. And then, near the end, the discovery that the deadliest fire of all was the company's own success, and that the way out was not to build more, but to remember what it was for. 3 generations of a Danish family kept making the same bet over and over, that a child's toy deserves to be built like it matters, that only the best is good enough. From a pile of ashes and a wooden duck, they built the most powerful brand in the world. And they built it, quite literally, from nothing. If a story about a small piece of plastic just changed how you think about what real focus looks like, subscribe. There are more builds like this one.